Mother Nature functioned here for tens of thousands of years until man came. And everything functioned just fine. People were able to survive off the land.
Perenniality is sort of the overarching strategy. And so we're proving with Kernza what can be done as we perennialize other crops. And that's really where we start to have much larger scale and impact.
For 100 years, farmers have been planting the same grains the same way. Is there a better option? One scientific nonprofit in the middle of the Great Plains thinks so and has been working on a perennial solution. Nick Schmitz heads out into the field to find out the latest from the Land Institute.
Welcome to the Land Institute. We are standing right at the top of Wahab Prairie, which is a little remnant mixed grass prairie right up the bank of the Smoky Hill River. The Land Institute was founded in this place right outside of Salina, Kansas back in 1976.
And what happens here at the Land Institute?
We are an agricultural research organization. We're a nonprofit, and what we're doing is learning how to develop perennial grain crops that can be grown in diverse cropping systems and mixtures that can feed people and that can be stewarded by human communities across the landscape.
When you say a perennial grain crop, what does that mean?
It's a great question. So we're standing amidst a prairie that's full of perennials. This is a mostly perennial ecosystem. And what that means is that the plants that grow here grow for multiple years. They recur. Their life cycle is ongoing. And so rather than an annual plant that completes its whole life cycle within one growing season, perennial plants have living roots below ground that stay alive for multiple years. So perennials include lots of trees and shrubs and a lot of prairie grasses.
So, Aubrey, when you're telling me about developing these new perennial grains, what exactly is the process?
So one pathway that we have teams of researchers working on is to identify wild perennial plants that could be good grain crops. So in those kind of domestication pathways, some of the plants that we're working on include Kernza perennial grain. So this is produced from intermediate wheatgrass or Thinopyrum intermedium, which is a Eurasian crop that was, as a plant, brought to the U.S. as a forage crop, so grazed by animals. And then over the last several decades, many decades, this has been identified for potential human grain use. So that's sort of one pathway, the domestication pathway. And then another pathway is to take an existing kind of annual elite grain crop. So here you might think of wheat or sorghum, and take that already high-yielding grain crop and go back and identify some of the wild perennial relatives that could be crossed with that. That kind of hybridization, wide hybridization process is how our perennial wheat program is proceeding, and then how our perennial sorghum or milo is proceeding. And then we have been in connection with a perennial rice breeding program in China, which is another kind of crop along those lines.
These are all some of the seeds that our grains produce. This one is wheat, so this is just an example of what is already growing out in fields. This is an annual crop. This is perennial wheat. You can see the seed head here. This is it broken up, and then the flour that it makes. This is a similar setup with the Kernza perennial grain here. This little vial represents what the forage variety looks like. So this is what we started with before the breeding process. And you can kind of see the differences that over the decades here we've been able to breed, as well as the flour. This is perennial sorghum. And this is kind of in different states. So this is dehulled sorghum. And then this is a little bit of what you might actually see out on the plant, what the head looks like. This is silphium, our oilseed. This is one of our ones that's kind of at the beginning of domestication. So you can see it's still got its hulls on. We haven't quite figured out, like we have with some of the other grains, how to get the hull off of it in a really efficient way. And so it's really papery, but it still has a lot of that oil that we're looking for. This is what a head looks like. They're really fragile, but that's kind of what, after the flower is done blooming and all of the petals fall off, it looks like this, and these seeds are what we collect, and then you can use it as an oil. And lastly, we have the baki bean here, which is our pulse crop, so it has a lot of protein in it. It has a really unique shape of its hull. It makes me think of aliens. and it's really fun, a texture. And then this is what it looks like de-hulled. So you can see it's really similar to a lentil. It has a really mild flavor. And then you can also create a flour with it that is really high protein. So that's a little bit of an overview of some of the perennial crops that we grow here at the Land Institute.
And what is the benefit of a perennial versus an annual?
So if we think about these perennial ecosystems comprised of perennial plants around the world, like grasslands and prairies, or like forest or tundras, you can think of rainforest or deciduous forest, all these mostly perennial ecosystems. Those are really different than the agricultural systems that mostly feed people. As you were driving up to the Land Institute and coming up to our research plots and the prairie here, you drove by a lot of wheat fields here in Kansas. It's summer, we're just in the midst of wheat harvest, and wheat is an annual crop that completes its life cycle within just 1 year. And most of the grain crops that cover so much of the Earth's terrestrial landscapes and that provide the majority of human food, those grain crops are annuals. So if you think about wheat, rice, corn, soy, milo, all of these are annual grain crops. And so the question then is, why would we be interested in having perennial versions of those grain crops instead of annuals? And it has to do with those living roots that hold onto the soil below the ground. So the ability to hold on to soil and to actually allow the soil to continue to form rather than to leave it vulnerable to washing away, to blowing away, is really important for us to be able to sustain agriculture for the long term. So those roots are able to allow those soil formation processes to continue because they are part of these perennial systems, just like all of these ecosystems that allowed soils to be built in the first place, like here on the prairie. So those roots allow those plants to regrow without having to be replanted every single year, without us having to till or disturb the landscape in order to clear it of all those vegetation to be able to replant. And those perennial plants with those deeper, more robust root systems are able to be more effective at using some of the different things that plants need to grow. So we're trying to accomplish both that kind of conservation and also being able to provide staple foods to people through an agriculture that is more like the natural systems that have evolved on Earth.
Since you've been growing kerns on your land, what are some of the benefits that you've noticed?
The first year we started, obviously, with the worst acres. You could take a shovel out there that year, you wouldn't have found one worm, ever. Harvested it that first year, and then we grazed it twice that first year after harvest in the summer, and then we grazed it later that fall also. And those two grazing cycles, the next spring, I could take my pliers out there after a rain, move cow pies, and just gobs and gobs of earthworms. So immediately in year one, we're starting to get, things are changing. And the great thing is you've always paid it forward, 2018, we seeded it, great stand. We've paid it forward to 19, to 20, to 21, to 22. That first year we seeded, and everything went really smooth, and we got to harvest, and it was about 110 degrees, I think, that end of July, and we're standing on top of the combine trying to get it out of the combine, and I looked at him and I said, if everybody has to do this, I said, nobody's gonna do it. So getting it seeded and established, everybody's used to doing things like that, but the harvesting is a different challenge. We all have these preconceptions as to how things should work. It doesn't work with perennial ag. You can't just take it to the elevator, The marketing's different, the handling's different, the processing, all those steps. And so that's why we started Sustainagrain, was to take that back half away, those headaches, away from the farmer.
Our mission with Sustainagrain is to make it easy for growers to switch from annual agriculture to perennial agriculture, and to make it easy for food and beverage brands to switch to sourcing perennial grain crops.
And how do you do that?
We help growers by producing high-quality seed, providing agronomic support, processing their grain into ingredients, and then we help brands to source those ingredients, find new uses for those things. So creating flaked kernza, creating malted kernza, creating a whole new, just entire brands, working with the R&D teams at the food and beverage companies that partner with us.
So can you tell us a little bit about the difference in sort of what you're inputting with the Kernza compared to a more conventional annual grain?
One of the important input pieces is labor. So with a perennial, you're just out on your tractor less. There's less wear and tear on the equipment. There's less diesel being used. The other thing that we like about Kernza is that it fits nicely into our cropping calendar. So it's not coming at busy times. We find that it generally seems to require less water once it's established. And the other thing that it does is when we do have a large rain event, that water is actually getting down into the soil rather than washing off.
Because it's a perennial and the activities of the roots in the soil, we're not having competition with weeds. You know, Mother Nature is always trying to find solutions for monoculture systems. And we have weeds and some diversity out there that we didn't seed, but the bad weed seeds that we typically look in annual cropping systems, those aren't getting expressed. So we're not using herbicides, especially after year one. We don't need any herbicides. I mean, it takes care of itself. We're working with a degraded resource. You know, we've been here 100 years roughly. My ancestors brought over turkey red wheat, and the technology they had then would have been steel. Had the plow behind a horse, you know, and you're oxidizing that soil, breaking down organic matter that's probably at 6%. You know, we're getting lots of nutrients, okay? After 100 years, we can't do that anymore. Integration of cattle and livestock, you know, when you start cycling, completing the poop loop, that helps a lot. At the end of the day, though, we need to grow something, and that acre needs to be productive. Otherwise, we're going backwards. I mean, there's a lot of people to feed. But because it's a grain that's a perennial and allows for livestock, we've got a two-legged stool. You know, we don't quite need all the safety nets traditional ag kind of depends upon. So we need rainfall to create the green vegetation, right? And when you go to deserts and things like that, you see all this dry matter, so you know things grew. But the one process that nobody talks about is getting that dry matter back to the soil, back to the brown matter, okay? So how do you do that? Animal impact is the only way you get that back to the soil. And so that's what's completing the loop. We can have all the rainfall we want, but if the soil's not cycling, it doesn't matter. And so in this system, you see a lot more soil coverage, the soil's cooler, keeps the water in, infiltrates better.
So, Aubrey, when I think about more conventional wheat crops, I imagine it's taken thousands of years to get where we're at with those crops. So what is the time frame for the work you're doing here at the Land Institute in developing more perennial crops?
You're totally right. Domesticating and breeding the annual grain crops that feed people now has taken generations of people, and those domestication processes are still ongoing. The Land Institute was founded more than 40 years ago, and the programs that we are working on and the crops that we're developing are also going to take a lot of time. But we do also have the benefit now of newer emerging technologies that could be beneficial. So as we continue the age-old human processes of cycles of selection that take time to select, replant, grow again, we are also really interested in being able to invest more resources in growing the number of plants and the number of people and the number of places in this work so that we can make progress to develop perennial grain crops. And we think that with that type of investment in research and development, we can have perennial grain crops over the coming decades that could be comparable to some of these annual crops in terms of yield. But a lot of work and effort has to go into that, and we have a long ways to go. I hope that with a growing global research community in places around the world, that the perennial grain research that's started and rooted here can result in many kinds of perennial grain crops.
There's a book written by David Montgomery. It's called Dirt, The Erosion of Civilization. And he looks back at all the people in the world that have become extinct. And the common denominator from all the extinct societies has been the loss of soil and the inability to produce food. We've only been here 100 years, but we've lost a tremendous amount of topsoil. So with a degraded resource, we can't simply just pull the rug and expect it to function like it should or it did. I don't know what it'll be, but something's probably going to need to change, or we're headed down a real slippery slope. But I think Kernza might not be the whole answer, but it's a nice place to start and start exploring things, you know.
So I'm from a fourth generation Kansas farm. I know that the way that my ancestors farmed is not going to be able to continue. Like, the Midwest has lost a third of its topsoil since 1850. And it's because it's just washed out to the Gulf of Mexico. We have to do something to protect soils, Perennials are a really important way to do that. And if we don't change how we farm, then we're going to start losing options in the future. And this is a way of protecting what we have.